that we could have a better society, a society without inequality, without class differences, without rich and the poor, is an old idea. What happens in Robin Hood? Why was Robin Hood beloved by the people? Say it again. He took from the rich and gave to the poor. That was what? Wealth redistribution. Now, the king called him a bandit, but the people loved him. And let me tell you something. Do you know there are places in the United States right now, today, that have banned Robin Hood for that very thing? Right now, you hear about all this book banning going on? Look at the list of the books. Robin Hood. So this idea, Thomas More in the medieval period. How many have ever heard the word utopia? What is a utopia?
It's like a perfect area.
A perfect society, right? This idea of a perfect society without poverty, without suffering, without want, without deprivation. This is an old idea. Thomas More, circa, I don't know, somebody tell me, 1200 maybe, wrote the book Utopia. How many have heard of Plato's Republic? No? Oh my goodness. Yeah, high school, you haven't heard, at least heard of the Republic? We gotta have revolution in the Newark public school system. You can't go to college and say you never read the Republic. But Plato's Republic is another book. St. Thomas Aquinas, he wrote about the perfect society. Many people wrote about the perfect society and the fact that we need, that poverty was the root of human suffering, that progress, that the fundamental idea of progress was in fact the elimination of poverty. That progress meant the elimination of human suffering. That progress meant the reduction of labor. Like today we have an 8-hour workday, right? Did the 8-hour workday always exist? No, it's a relatively new concept. Thought of in the 19th century and become pretty much popular, accepted by the 20th century. But in the old days, people worked before the sun rose and worked until the sun set. It was work, eat, sleep. That was your life. Work, eat, sleep. So yes.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So I'm in school to get my second master's, and
right.
one of my professors.
Oh, you're not in the debate club? You're a teacher? I thought you was a student. Go ahead.
Take it. I'll take that. Anyways, one of my professors, Dr. Jacobson, we were talking about the sort of unfairness in regards to how wealth is distributed, not just in the United States, but just in the world in general. And so he brought up the idea of race, and that race really isn't a thing. That race was sort of a concept that came from, I forget where he said it came from, but it was sort of created in a way to keep certain people in certain fields.
Yes.
So that they would lack the growth in the economy, right?
Right.
So if you're born of a certain race, it's almost expected
Right.
that you would be in poverty. If you were born
Right.
of a certain race, it's always expected
Right.
that you would have a better education.
Right.
That was the first time was actually hearing that.
Right.
So what do you think about that?
It's true.
Okay.
Race is a social construct. And race is used to justify that social construct, to justify the perpetuation of the existing social order and all of its inequality. And the idea of race is old. This is where the debate is. Most people accept the idea that modern racism, which I subscribe to, modern racism as we know it today, arose and throve with the development of the African slave trade. That modern racism as we know it, anti-black racism, arose as a justification for the enslavement of black people. And a lot of them knew from the beginning this was BS. But you can't enslave millions of people and treat them like animals and not have an ideology that justifies this. Because remember, that ideology was contradictory to the religious values that people were being taught at that time. And at that time, most values were religious values. If you got education at all, you got it through a religious institution, more or less. So, this idea of race, you can read in, for instance, if you read Ashley Montague's book, Race, Man's Most Dangerous Myth, he begins the book with a quote from the Rig Veda, talking about how Brahma is going to beat the black skin off of his enemies. So there was this idea of anti-blackness. And if you read White Over Black by Jordan, he talks about this idea of race that existed in the medieval period before the African slave trade. Because remember, what? Africa controlled Europe for almost 700 years. Did you know that? Did you know that? Did anybody in here know that? The period of the Moors. Who knew about the Moors? The Moors came out of northern Africa, came over the Straits of Hercules, over what became known as the Rock of Gibraltar, named after the Muslim general that in fact overcame the European armies that were opposing him, came into Europe and controlled Europe from Spain and Portugal all the way up into Germany, from roughly about the 700s to 1492. Literally the last battle between the Moors and the Castilians was in January of 1492, the Battle of Granada. So there was some animosity toward the Moors, you know, and a lot of this took on a racial character. And if you read literature from the period, like you read Shakespeare, Shakespeare mentions the Moors, uses terms like blackamoor, and so on and so forth. So I'm trying to stay with what I'm charged to do here. Mr. Austin said,
no, this is good.
wealth redistribution. So people had to come up with a justification. All anthropologists know that there's one race, and that is the human race. One fundamental race. But that's not what's going on in the social order. So if we're going to have slavery, then we got to come up with a good reason to justify what we're doing. And that's when you get this development of a whole pseudoscience. This was no small thing. It's like all of science was pulled in to justify this enslavement. That black people were somehow in fear. And they knew this was wrong. They knew they absolutely, like, we were in fear. We ruled y'all for 7. What are y'all talking about? But you know, empires rise and empires fall. And that's on the historical scale. So, yes, race is a social construct, but it's a social construct used to justify a particular socioeconomic arrangement. And that arrangement in the 17th century, 16th, well, going back really to the 16th century, because the first Africans are brought here in the 1500s, was used to justify the enslavement of African people. First, actually, the enslavement of the indigenous, because for the first 100 years of European imperial colonialism, for the first 100 years, it was the indigenous that were enslaved, not the Africans. The people when Columbus comes to the Caribbean, he never set foot on what we call the United States. He came into the Caribbean. On his first voyage, he took slaves. The first one, not the third, the first one. And every voyage thereafter. And so, you know, there was there was a kind of disorientation, because you're teaching people to love your brother and treat other people like you would be treated, but now you treat these people like beasts. You know, Columbus was like, bring me a thimble full of gold every day. Those of you who do not bring the gold, we will cut off your hand. We'll cut off your foot. We'll cut off your leg. We'll skin you alive. Read Columbus's own journals. Don't take my word for anything. You could read a good book to read would be They Came Before Columbus by Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. Read that. And Columbus says that he essentially tells on himself what they did. So there was this priest, his name was Bartholomew de las Casas. And de las Casas had been in the New World, observing how the Spanish and the Portuguese were behaving. And de las Casas said essentially, you know, we should not enslave the indigenous because they have souls. Souls, right? The soul. The thing that they said goes to heaven or goes to hell. The indigenous have souls. But we can enslave the African because the African has no soul. This is what de las Casas initially said. Now later on, I think toward the end of his life, he recanted. But initially, that wasn't his beginning position. And this is why scholarship is important. Because you read somebody, you know, you read Martin Luther King, and what Martin Luther King said in 1955, and then you read Martin Luther King, what Martin Luther King said in 1968, you're going to get two different impressions of Martin Luther King. You read Malcolm X speeches in 1960, you're going to get one impression of Malcolm. You read Malcolm X in February 1965, you're going to have another impression of Malcolm X. This is why scholarship is important. Because somebody says, well, get this book and read. You get that book and you quote something they said, you know, when they were 25 years old, and you get to the class and you give it to the professor, and the professor said, well, yeah, he said that when he was 25, but look at what he said when he was 55. You know, this is why scholarship is important. So anyway, getting back to wealth redistribution. So this idea that we should have a more equitable redistribution of wealth to create a better society is an old idea, but it gains more and more currency, particularly in the capitalist period of development. Why in the capitalist period of development? Because in that era, development was very rapid, and it was very intensely exploitative. Almost from the beginning of what's called industrial capitalism, which starts in England, you could begin to see the devastating effects on the working class. And this was even before, I'm not talking about slavery now. I'm talking about in England, the English, all of them look racially the same, but now you have these class divisions, and the people who are doing all the work live like slaves. I remember W.E.B. Du Bois, when he visited Russia, he said the peasants in Russia, their lives were essentially almost the same as the slaves that existed in the United States in the 19th century. So the idea that we should redistribute wealth comes into currency really, you could really say in the 18th century. You know, you begin to have the French philosophers that address this, people like Rousseau and others. Even during the American Revolution, Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, he wrote another book, the title of which escapes me at the moment. He advocated a basic universal income. That was during the American Revolution. That in order to eliminate poverty, we should give people a certain amount of money at birth, and then they can use that money to better themselves throughout the rest of their life. This idea, that you think this is a new idea, it's an old idea. A universal income, that poverty should be eliminated. Now what happens is in the I guess you could say the 19th century, you see the beginnings of socialism. Now, when I say socialism in the early 19th century, I'm talking about pre-Karl Marx. Socialism did not start with Karl Marx. There were socialists before Karl Marx. Socialists were people who essentially said the wealth of society should be shared by society. Basically it. And they had all kind of schemes to achieve this. But the difference comes into being when Karl Marx starts writing and starts critiquing capitalism. I remember when I was a senior at Arts High School, I had to take a humanities class. And my teacher, her name was Mrs. Rich. And that was the first time I had ever seen or heard of the Communist Manifesto. They had us read the Communist Manifesto. And I'm going to tell you the truth. I couldn't make heads or tails out of it when I was 16 years old. I was like, you know, it starts with the word, there's a specter haunting Europe. I thought it was going to be a horror story, you know. I thought it was a specter, it's a ghost. And I really couldn't make a lot of sense out of it. And to be truthful, our teachers did not spend a lot of time. They said, here, read this. I think we may have had one discussion in the classroom, and that was that. Marx differed from the other socialists in that his argument was not fundamentally a moral argument, although it was a moral argument. You know, from a moral point of view, he said, yes, poverty shouldn't exist, but what Marx took it a step further and critiqued capitalism to in fact show that the social system and not human frailty was the cause of poverty. See, it's just like today. Some people say, well, you're poor because you're lazy. Or you're poor because you're a spendthrift. But Marx said that poverty and inequality was a byproduct of the economic system itself. And that's where you begin to see a difference, because he tried to show how, in fact, the social system produced the inequality. The social system produced the poverty. The social system also would lay the groundwork, lay the seeds for a better economic system, which he said would be socialism. So, to make a long story short, and I know we don't have a lot of time left, this is a difficult subject because it's very complex. Most people realize income inequality and wealth inequality is wrong. Many people and other societies have taken the approach of trying to eliminate the worst aspects of that system without changing the entire system. So, you hear people today talk about universal health care, right? Of all the rich countries in the world, and there are about 37 rich countries of the 202 nations that are in the United Nations, of the 37 rich countries, the United States is the only country that doesn't have universal health care. You get sick in France, and France is a capitalist country, they pay your cab fare to come to the hospital. They pay all your hospital bills, and they pay your cab fare home. Canada, our northern neighbor, has universal health care. Mexico, our southern neighbor, has universal health care. Japan, England, the country in which industrial capitalism was born, England, has universal health care. National, what is it called? NIH, National Institute for Health. Yes. Why? Because one of the worst aspects of living is not being able to get medical care. So early on, some of these people say, oh no, we're not going to overthrow the whole system, but we will provide universal health care. We're not going to overthrow the whole system, but we will provide education for everybody. We're not going to overthrow the system, but we will provide a minimum wage. So even in the rich countries, you see a difference. This is why comparative studies is so important. Because if you don't look at how other countries do things, you will think that the way we do it here is the only way you can possibly do it. And it's not. You will think that this is the best of all possible worlds, when in fact another world is possible. For instance, the Scandinavian countries. What are the Scandinavian countries? Somebody tell me. Yes.
Finland, Iceland, Greenland, Scotland, Ireland.
Not Scotland, Ireland. You were good with the first three.
Denmark.
Got it? What's next to Finland?
Sweden.
Sweden. And what's the last one? Norway. So the Scandinavian could give that young person a hand. Because most would know the Scandinavian countries. Most people don't know that. Most adults don't know that. You know, they don't. They front like they do what they don't. So these countries, you have universal health care. You have free college. No student loans. They wouldn't know what you were talking about. Free college. Guaranteed minimum income. They don't have a minimum wage. They have a living wage. And why are we going to have a minimum wage to increase poverty? Why would we do that? Let's give everybody a wage so that they'll have enough money to pay their rent, pay their bills, put food on the table, take care, raise a family. Paid family and sick leave. In Sweden, they get 18 months. A woman is going to have a baby. She gets 18 months with pay. The father gets time too. So these are called social democratic countries. They're not communists. They don't call themselves socialists. But they have what's called a welfare state. A state that takes care of the people. Now, they have very high taxes, but if you got your health care taken care of, you don't have student loans, you have a living wage, even if your taxes are high, you have enough to take care of yourself. And do you know that there's such a thing called the happiness index? They rank countries. Who's the most happy with their country? The Scandinavians. I think Denmark was the #1 this year, the happiest people. And they have that because of what? Wealth redistribution. Wealth redistribution. What do we have here? In the United States, we have the highest level of wealth and income inequality that has ever existed in the history of humanity. And Google it if you don't believe me. Right now in the United States, there are 3 men who have more wealth than the lower 165 million half of this country. 3. I didn't say 300. I didn't say 30%. 3 men. For the first time in human history, you have human beings who are on the verge of becoming trillionaires. How much is a billion? Mathematics. How much is a billion? It's a lot, right? How much is a billion? Say it. Say it loud.
1,000 million.
A billion is 1,000 million. If you had $1 billion bills, we couldn't move in this building. A billion is 1,000 million. What's a trillion?
10 billion.
No. What's a trillion?
1,000.
Say it.
Yeah.
1,000 billion. A trillion is 1,000 billion. And that's what we have in the United States. We have 2 or 3 individuals on the verge of becoming trillionaires. You have companies that have already achieved $1 trillion in net worth. Never before in human history has the gap between the rich and the poor been so large. And this leads to others, yes.
Well, I was gonna, I know.
We're at the end?
Well, no, not an abrupt ending. I'm just gonna ask you a question. What are the implications of that?
Well, what are the implications of that is I'll put it this way, people who study politics and sociology and anthropology and archaeology and all these other things know that once you have great wealth and income inequality, it leads to social destabilization. Social destabilization, and in a lot of times that social destabilization results in what? Crime. What else? Revolution. Revolution. The English Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Cuban Revolution. Because when you have that kind of wealth inequality, you have great poverty and great suffering, and people, human beings, will only take that suffering but for so long. Now, but for so long could be different amount of time in different places. Because but for so long could be a long time, but eventually people are going to say enough is enough. In the United States, poverty and capitalism, how capitalism works, and when we're talking about housing in particular, we're talking about the real estate industry. Real estate has produced a profound housing crisis. In the United States today, we have perhaps as many as 600,000 people who are homeless or houseless, as the current term is houseless, but the popular term, you know it, is homelessness. People literally living on the street. Not kind of, literally living on the street. You can see them. You can go to Penn Station in Newark. You can go to Midtown Manhattan. I was astounded to see all the people they had sleeping around the hotel, the Roosevelt Hotel across the street from Madison Square Garden a couple of weeks ago. Profound housing crisis, because unlike other countries, even countries that are not socialist, but other countries that recognize housing as a human right, in the United States, housing is a source of profit. Homes are bought and sold. And the higher the price, the higher the profit. Even like myself, a homeowner, right? I don't own a house now, but I did own a home in Montclair. I bought my home for one price, and I sold it for a higher price, which is really the essence of capitalism, right? Is to buy, this is an old saying, to buy cheap and to sell dear. Buying cheap and selling dear. I bought my house at one price, and I sold my house for almost twice what it was worth. So what we have now is a housing market that's being driven by profit. The houses cost more than people can afford, and so you have a crisis. People buy houses with the income that they had. Inflation drives up their mortgage. It drives up the taxes they have to pay, and soon they can no longer afford to make their mortgage payment, and their house, they lose their house, is foreclosed on. Yes?
I just want to ask a question. Like, I think like in the late 1900s, like 1970s, 1980s.
Yes.
Didn't the government used to build houses?
Yes. This is again one of the ways of ameliorating the impact of the economic system. And this is an idea that came into being again in basically at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, that government, you read a guy named Keynes, Thomas Keynes. When people talk about Keynesian economics, they're talking about a type of economics where the government intervenes into the economic system to try to ameliorate some of the worst impacts of that economic system. Keynesian economics. And so you had people, you had governments building housing, building affordable housing. And that came into being primarily in the United States during what? The Great Depression. Because before that, it was basically sink or swim. You on your own, you know. But the Great Depression caused so much social dislocation, Roosevelt said we had to intervene. The government must intervene. So public housing became a government project. And public housing projects were built across the country. Not only housing projects, but single-family home developments. You know, and you had programs like the GI Bill. This was before the poverty programs of the 60s. If you were in the Army, you survived the war, you come home, the GI Bill was passed, you could get money to go to school, and you could get money to buy a house. And that's how a lot of people got their house after World War II, through the GI Bill. The unfortunate thing is because we had a kind of racialized capitalism in the United States because of the way capitalism developed with slavery, many of the black soldiers did not get those benefits. Just like when, during the Great Depression, when things like Social Security were created, but because before Social Security,